So like I said, we're mostly going to be reviewing characterization today. We're just going to take a quick look at the baseline of characterization, kind of what it's good for, why we bother looking at it. If you had a chance to go through the sniper, you'll know that the assignment that was posted with that was about plot. Now, the reason why we look at plot in stories has nothing to do with plot itself. In fact, before we turn to characterization, I want to just remind you of a couple of things about sort of why we look at these elements of literature and why we bother kind of looking at things like plot, characterization, why we spend so much time on those things, and when we can stop spending so much time on those things. You'll also need a couple of things today. You'll need two things. You will need your journal, and do not worry about yesterday's or Tuesday's journal entry. There wasn't a journal entry attached to the assignment. Like I said, the assignments got kind of messed up. You can just write like Miss Wiseau excused on the 26th. So for today's journal entry, I would like you to make sure you have your journal document open, and I also want you to make sure that you have something to take notes. Now you can use an independent Google Doc. You can use your journal document if you would like. Personally, I think it will probably be better if you have something separate to take notes on from your journal document, either, again, a physical notebook or like a Google Doc. But you will want to have those just to take some kind of brain refresher notes. So for today's journal, you are just going to take a look at this here set of images. Now, these are all medieval snails from the margins of medieval manuscripts. This is called marginalia. Marginalia is just the little drawings and pictures that scribes would kind of decorate manuscripts with. So one of their big things was snails. They loved snails. They loved snails. And one of their biggest things to do was draw, as you see in image 6 here, like snails being ridden into battle by like rabbits and squirrels. I don't know why, it was just like a medieval meme, basically. So take a look at these snails, and then in your journal, just note down which snail you're vibing with and why. And then in the chat, tell me the number of the snail that you are most vibing with today. Which snail feels most like you? Like, you know, we've got the beleaguered, number 1. Number 2, questioning his life choices. Number 5 looks like he's singing a little like song to himself. He looks very happy. Number 7 is just not having it. So in the chat, tell us all which snail you're vibing with today, and then in your journal, in just a couple of sentences, express why that snail speaks so much to you today. Which snail are you most feeling? Okay, Lauren says she's at a number 7. Yeah, that's legit. That is a legit emotion. Kara says she's at a 5. That snail is so happy. Caroline says she's at 2. Yeah, that's probably where I'm at today. I'm at a 2. Iris is a 4. Keely says 5. Matthew's at a 3. Hanging out with your little rat bro. Emily says number 2. Eden also at a 2. Yeah, 2. Very popular emotion today. We are all snails questioning our lives and our life choices. All right, anybody else? I think that's almost all of us, so we'll go ahead and move on, but if you want to share anything else about your snail vibe, feel free to post that in the chat, and we'll move on. Okay, so when we think about plot, right, you think about like, oh, the rising action, the climax, the inciting action, you know, why? Like that's something that kind of every year you have drilled into you, along with like characterization, conflict, what a metaphor is versus a simile, like kind of all this really basic story structure stuff. And the reason we bother with those things is not because they actually matter. Plot doesn't really matter, right? Like knowing the order of events in a story doesn't really matter in and of itself. Like being able to say, oh, this is part of the rising action own, it's not really worth studying. Things like plot and character and conflict are not the ends. They're not the end goals of why we look at stories and literature. They're just tools. Those are just tools to help us explore the things in literature that actually do matter. Like there are lots of stories that are completely amazing and don't really have a plot. Like if you have, and I think we talked about this a little if you were with us at all on Monday, this will kind of feel like review, but we're going to go a little more into it with characterization today as well. So remember how lots of stories don't really have a plot, like 12 Angry Men, no plot, Breakfast Club doesn't have a plot. It's just people in a room doing stuff. And characterization is kind of the characterization. Now, plot I described on Monday, like understanding how a plot supports the other parts of a story is what matters. Understanding how the author can sometimes play with the plot. Like in The Sniper, the story just kind of ends, right? We don't really get a full resolution to the story. At the end of The Sniper, the main character comes down to the street and like rolls the body over of the other sniper, discovers it was his brother, and then what? Right? It's kind of a cliffhanger. We don't get a feeling of resolution in the same way that during war, you don't get to feel a sense of closure just because you've survived a battle. You don't get to feel a sense of closure when you've shot your own brother. And so understanding how that part of the plot affects things like how the characters feel, how it affects the themes of the story, that's what matters. So if the plot is the skeleton on which the rest of the story hangs, the characterization is kind of like the muscles or maybe the connective tissue, right? Like the ligaments and tendons of the story. So where plot underlies things like character, because the events of the plot let us have a chance to see who the characters are, right? How do characters respond to different situations? How do characters make different things happen? How do they change over the course of the plot? So characterization does depend on plot to some degree, but only insofar as that plot provides kind of a landscape on which we see the characters create the story. Because you don't need a plot to have a story, right? Like The Breakfast Club doesn't have a plot, but it still has a story. You need characters if you're going to have a story. That's the big difference. You don't need a plot as such. You do need characters. So with that, let's nothing else, and we'll start thinking about some characterization. Oh, it worked this time. Okay. That's for tomorrow. So we're going to just review some terms. This is where you're going to want to take the most notes, I think, is where before we move to character, I just wanted to say, when you are thinking about that plot summary in kind of the plot chart for the sniper, the situation is just kind of like the broad setup. So the situation in the sniper is like, oh, it's a war story. There's a war happening. It's the Irish Civil War. First situation is sort of like the background, right? The story. And you'll see that in Lather and Nothing Else as well, where the situation is kind of like the setting writ large, right? If the setting is, well, it's in a city or it's in the jungle, it's in a town, it takes place, in 1923, it takes place in, if things like the date and place and weather and whatnot are the setting, then your situation is like, what's underpinning this story? What's underpinning the conflict? Like, where does it come from? So again, to use like the Breakfast Club example, the situation might be Saturday detention. So if you still had questions about that, shoot me an email. But for things like setting, situation is just sort of a part of that. It's like the setup, so to speak. So characterization, just a quick review. We're going to go over the character continuums, direct and indirect characterization, and steal. But then we're going to go on to talk about why we bother thinking about characterization in these terms and how to start going a little bit deeper. So characterization is kind of two things at once. It's both who the characters are in a story, but also how they influence or demonstrate the themes of the story. So it's both, this character is like a cranky old man, but also his characterization has to do with, the theme of you're never too old to learn new things, something like that. So there are lots of types of characters that you'll encounter in stories. A lot of times we have a tendency to kind of reduce characters to like character archetypes. And there are a lot of archetypes that show up again and again, right? The wise old man, the young hero in the coming of age story, the scary temptress character. There are a lot of character archetypes. But what's important here is that there are, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, just kind of some categories of how characters are written. And that matters insofar as if we understand how a character is being written, we understand a little bit better what we should be or what we can be taking away from that character. So you've got your main characters and your subordinate characters, right? That's your first continuum, where you've got your protagonist and your antagonist, and you're just like, your Luke Skywalkers and your Harry Potters and your Darth Vaders over here on this end, where they are central. They are the central characters. And then over here at this other end, you've got like the guy running past in the background in like a garage scene or something. You see them, they walk by, they're there in the story, but you don't know anything about them, right? They're subordinate characters. They're not main characters. And then in between, you have all of your characters who show up to one degree of importance or another. They're not the main characters, but they're also like, they have names, right? You know something about them. So that's our first kind of character slider, character continuum. The second is flat and round, and then static and dynamic. And those you're probably pretty familiar with. So the flat characters, again, are the ones we don't know much about. And it's really hard to have a flat character who is also a main character. Because in order for someone to be a main character, you need to know some stuff about their motivations, their interior space, their psychology, their wants, their needs, their conflicts. And for a flat character, you just don't get that kind of detail. You don't get a good flat characters are in a story just to give it some context, to give it some texture, to make it feel a little more realistic. Now, by contrast, your round characters are the ones that do have a lot of just depth and detail. You can really picture them in your head, you can describe them. You know so much about them in a story that you feel like they are a real person almost, right? You sense that even if you aren't given enough information to be able to describe them fully, like in Lather and Nothing Else, you probably couldn't give me a physical description of the barber, but we know so much about their interior selves that they feel very realistic to us. And your round character, like your roundest characters, are almost always your main characters. Now, remember, that's round in the literary sense, not round in the physical sense, although you can have a character who is both, you know, rotund and a main character. And then static and dynamic characters. Static characters don't change much, if you recall. Now, this can be for a couple of reasons. Often at like lower grades, like in middle school, we're taught to think that static characters are also flat characters, but that's not necessarily true. You can also have main, like really round main characters who are static for a couple of reasons. Either because they are personally resistant to change, maybe that's part of their personality, or because the journey that they go through in the story just doesn't require that they change very much. I mean, again, let's look at the sniper or the barber in The Sniper, and then in Lather and Nothing Else. Those characters don't really change all that much. They, like, the stories just don't cover enough of a span of time for them really to change, but they're still very central, very developed characters. Now, you can also have, with dynamic characters, this same thing. Dynamic characters are just characters who change as a result of the story's events. They can change a little, they can change a lot. Usually if you have a dynamic character, they change in at least one kind of really meaningful way. And both your major and your minor characters, your main and subordinate characters, can be dynamic, right? You can have a main character who undergoes tremendous change over the course of the story. And you can also have really minor characters who, like, they start the story one way and then they come back at the end of the story and they're totally different. You see this a lot with like minor recurring characters in TV shows where they'll show up in season 1 and be like, I don't know, some kind of lazy kind of burnout character, and they come back in like the 3rd or 4th season and they're like super successful and they've gotten married and bought a house. And, you know, so characters can change a lot, whether they're, you know, main characters or very minor characters. So static and dynamic don't necessarily correlate to flat and round, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to major and minor characters either. But these are kind of the 3 main character continuums that we see in stories. And again, it doesn't matter that you're able to identify if a character is static or dynamic. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're able to understand why it matters that a character is static, why it matters that a character is dynamic. All we're doing when we review things like plot, character, conflict, we're just making sure that we have a shared vocabulary to talk about stories. That's all we're really doing, is building a toolbox to help us dive more deeply into the ideas that these stories bring up for us. So does anybody have any questions so far about character continuums, about kind of like why we bother looking at things like plot, character? Any questions about kind of broadly the 2 questions? You can come off of mute if you want. You can also post, and also if you do post a question in the chat, I'll come back and look periodically, but you don't have to wait until I say, does anybody have any questions? Since it's just chat, like, you can post any questions you have at any time, just so you all know that. If you have a question, post it when you think of it. Okay, if you have no questions for now, then we'll move on to the next part of thinking about characterization, which is just a quick review of how we figure out what kind of character someone is. And there are 2 ways of doing this. We get direct characterization and indirect characterization. This is also kind of thought of as the show versus tell model of storytelling, where you can either just tell your reader what's going on, or you can show them what's going on. And usually just telling them is really boring. That's what you see a lot of in like very, very young children's books, that kind of like Dick and Jane style, like, look, Jane is climbing a hill. Look, Jane has fallen down a hill. Oh no, I hurt my knee, says Jane. So that's that very elementary kind of boring way of writing. Showing tends to be a lot more interesting. So that's the difference between direct and indirect characterization. With direct characterization, the writer just tells you useful. It's not always a bad idea. Like, it doesn't mean that the writer is bad if they do direct characterization. It's usually a conscious choice because they just need you to know a thing and move on with the story. So when a writer uses direct characterization, you don't have to do any of that detective work to figure out the character. So that's things like, quote, "The first thing Rainsford's eyes discerned was the largest man Rainsford had ever seen, a gigantic creature, solidly made and black-bearded to the waist." So here we're told that this dude that Rainsford is looking at is big, right? He's a big dude, he's built, and he's got a big black beard, right? We're just told that. We don't have to try to infer that from context clues. Or, quote, "Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners." Now, Jane Austen tells us this about Mr. Bingley because she wants to get on with the story, right? She's just introducing her characters so that she can kind of go on to the more interesting parts, right? Mr. Bingley is good-looking. He seems like a nice dude. He's laid back. He's handsome. He's gentlemanlike. So she tells us all of this so that later, when we are given indirect characterization, we can see how it matches up to this description of him. So she just goes ahead and gives us the description to kind of get it out of the way. So you can do direct characterization with physical traits or personality traits. Now, indirect characterization, again, is that show rather than tell. And you see this more often than you see direct characterization. Again, because it tends to be more interesting, writers prefer to use it. So part of this is that when writers their characters in action, and this gives you a chance to bring your own opinions and thoughts to bear on the situation. This lets you do some interpretive work and decide for yourselves what a character is like, right? So like if a character tells a lie, are they lying because they're a bad person, or are they lying to like protect another character? It kind of lets you make judgment calls, and it allows for a much more richer interpretation of the story, right? Because one person might interpret a story one way, one person might interpret that same evidence in a different way. But when you use things like indirect characterization, you allow for that kind of ambiguity and that kind of more interesting possibility. So there's lots of different ways to find and interpret indirect characterization, and you have almost assuredly run into this acronym before, STEAL. STEAL stands for speech, thoughts, effect, actions, and looks. And we're going to go through each one of these individually. So if you're taking notes, you don't have to like worry if you don't get all of this written down at once, because we're going to come back to it. And also remember, this recording and these slides will be available on Google Classroom, and the recording will be on YouTube as well. So where did we go? Okay, so let's start with speech. That's what a character says, how the character speaks. So that's not just like the words that they use, but also do they speak with an accent, a dialect? Do they sound really old-fashioned? Do they sound fancy? Do they sound very country? Kind of like how do they speak in addition to the way that they speak. The character's words are important because the exact words of a speaker reveal insight into who they are. In addition to, like I said, the words they use and like the accent or dialect or whatever, also pay attention to the tone in which they say their words. Like, do they speak sarcastically? Do they speak in a very gentle way? Are they very kind of short and curt? All of those things kind of come together to tell us a lot about a person. Think about in real life, like the people around you. What do you understand about communication based on how someone speaks? What do you understand about a person based on how they speak? So, in this example, my player did not step over the line, shouted the coach. I demand you read the tapes. He's shouting, he's demanding, he's using exclamation points. He's angry, and also he's lying because secretly, though, he was sure the official had made the right call. So he seems very aggressive. And then here, Harry, show your talents, barked the impatient instructor. Don't hold back this time. So the story tells us that the instructor is impatient, but also saying, show your talents, don't hold back, tells us that maybe the reason the instructor is impatient is that they want Harry to, prove that they can do the things that they can actually do. The instructor isn't impatient like Harry. The instructor is impatient because they want Harry to live up to his potential. Very revealing. So next up is thoughts. Characters' thoughts and feelings also obviously reveal information about what they're like. Thoughts and speech often contrast very interestingly, kind of in that first speech example where the coach says one thing but thinks another. Those incongruities between speech and thoughts are often some of the most interesting places to learn about who a character is. So in this example, where Frank insisted he wasn't tired or hungry, so he says he's not tired or hungry, but really he was both. He didn't want Aunt Judy to go to any trouble. So this again is more of a telling than a showing. We are told what his thoughts are, but we can also infer from this that because he doesn't want Aunt Judy to go to any trouble, that he's kind of a thoughtful person, right? He's impatient, he's tired, he's hungry, he's had it up to here with his last couple of days, but he doesn't want Aunt Judy to put herself out for his sake. So even though we're told what his thoughts are, we can still use them as personality. He puts his aunt's needs ahead of his own. So effects on other characters is a big one. Again, that we have to infer some stuff from. How one character reacts to another character often reveals qualities of them both. So Michael hugged Annie before he got out of the car. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. She smiled and replied, you always say that, and you'd better. Annie grinned, but her eyes were sad. So, Annie's response to Michael is like, oh, you won't call. And then she's like sad about it. So he seems kind of unreliable. She seems to not think he's very trustworthy, and she seems unsure of his intentions, his reliability. Notice that the story says that Michael hugged Annie. It doesn't say that she hugged him back. It says he laughed, but she smiled. So her response to him is not as enthusiastic as his response is to her. So noticing these little details about how people respond to a character really lets you know about kind of what the dynamic is between the two of them. So actions, this is very similar to effects on other characters. The old saw, actions speak louder than words, is just as true in fiction as it is in real life. And so characters' actions reveal their personality, their motivation, the situation they're in, and usually ties into one of the deeper themes of the story. So if we say, it was a cold October day when Christy's alarm headed for the door, she carefully adjusted her headphones. Then she pulled the sleeves of her turtleneck over her hands to keep out the cold. And she thinks to herself, here goes 10 miles, she thought as she began her run. I have to be ready for the spring marathon. So we see that literally what Christy is getting up early to run on a cold morning as she prepares for marathon. We can infer from that that she's probably some kind of athlete, right? She runs marathons. But more than that, we can infer that if she is willing to get up at 6 a.m. on a really cold morning, we can infer not just things about the situation, we can also infer things about who she is as a person, what matters to her, what her priorities are. If we're thinking about characters as real people, sometimes that can help us empathize with them and understand why they act the way they do. Because like, I'm not going to get up at 6 on a cold morning to run like 10 miles. I can barely run 10 yards. I have asthma. I prefer yoga and weightlifting. That's just me. But if Christy is willing to do this, if she's willing to put herself into this kind of discomfort, then she must really want to accomplish the goal that she has set for herself, which in this case is getting ready to run a marathon in the spring. So we don't just know what she's doing, we start to get a sense of why she's doing it, which is what indirect characterization is for. So finally, looks. Writers do most things on purpose. Now, just because writers don't do anything by accident doesn't mean that what they intend for the story to mean is the same thing that we, the readers, will take from the story. But writers create a character carefully. They create a character's appearance carefully. Our associations with a character may be different from the author's associations, but there's still a reason why the author puts their character in like jeans and a t-shirt instead of a suit, or they put their characters in yoga pants instead of like a military uniform. So a writer can imply or suggest things about the story, the themes, a character's personality, their priorities through the way that they are physically described. And that's not just like, what are they wearing, what do they look like, but obviously those are part of it. Also, what's the character's posture? How do they move their body through space, right? How do they pick up a cup? How do they walk down the street? Do they slump? Do they stand up straight? Are they clumsy? Do they knock things over? How do they move through the world? That's part of both actions and looks. Also, what is the character's facial expression? Like, I have kind of angry eyebrows. Unfortunately, that gives me a pretty bad case of, well, a bad resting face, let's say. But if a writer was writing me, they probably wouldn't include that detail, because just because I look angry, y'all probably already know that I'm not as a person. I'm pretty fluffy. But if a writer wanted to express an incongruity between how people perceive me and how I am, maybe the writer would say, you know, her face looked grumpy, but in fact, she was a great lover of naps and memes and never got in fights because she was conflict averse. You know, so you can draw those incongruities using facial expression, but a writer will always be very intentional with how they're describing the expression that their characters are wearing. And then finally, does the character have physical habits or tendencies? And that extends to things like, are they a smoker? Do they always put on their like slippers when they get home? Is like the first thing they do? Have kind of like, do they have a limp? Do they have a particular attachment to like a certain brand of chewing gum? Addictions? Anything to do with like what you would personally witness a character looking like or doing is kind of actions, but it can also be applied to looks, especially when some of those things carry certain cultural meanings. Like if somebody walks with a limp, if we read that somebody, you know, they leave their house, they lock their door, and they light a cigarette, we assume that they probably have some kind of physical addiction to smoking. So the line is blurred between a lot of these things in Steele, right? Looks are also tied into actions. Effects on other characters is tied into actions and speech. None of these things stand alone. They're all kind of mixed together in like a really nice jumble of who this character is. Because humans are complex, right? And a well-written character will also be very complex. So I wanted to give you some examples. So when we talk about how is the character dressed, again, is it yoga pants? Is it a military uniform? Is it a suit? Their posture, different words obviously are going to have different connotations. If their posture is rigid, they're very tense. If their posture is slumped, again, are they sleeping? Are they injured? Are they tired, lazy? Keep reading to find out. Is it languid? Are they like just kind of like chillaxing like a Greek god on a couch? That says something about who they are. You know, do they have red hair? Are they tall, muscular? Do they have big eyes? Are they old? Are they young? Is their facial expression cheerful? Is it dour? Is it concentrating? Do they have a bad case of RBF? And again, physical habits, chewing nails, tapping toes. If a character keeps scratching themselves, maybe they have fleas, I don't know. So ultimately, like with plot, characterization doesn't really matter on its own. We've seen examples where it kind of starts to matter more, where, you know, if you want to start getting a sense of who these people that you're reading about are, you want to pay attention to their characterization. But again, all of these things are just in service of the story that's being told and the ideas that are being born in that story. And so one of the things that you want to look at, you want to use characterization to dig deeper into character motivation. And character motivation is the reason behind a character's behaviors and actions, either in a given moment in time or throughout the story. And there are lots of ways of thinking about characterization or character motivation, right? Hopefully we'll talk about this a little more tomorrow in person. If we're here in person, if the snow, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs is something that we will keep coming back to over and over again this semester, because understanding why characters do what they do is really similar to understanding why humans in general do what they do. And Maslow's hierarchy is a good starting place. And Maslow's hierarchy was in kind of coming from Maslow, who wanted to understand like basically why humans behave the way they do. And so he started to think about how we prioritize our personal needs. And this is what he came up with. At the bottom is our physiological needs: food, water, warmth, and rest, right? In like emergency circles and like emergency preparedness circles, you'll often hear this described as the rule of 3, right? You can go 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and about 3 weeks without food. And so if you don't have these things, you will just die, right? If you don't have air, if you don't have water, if you don't have food, if you are cold, yeah, that's the other one. They say you can live about 3 hours at extreme temperatures, either extreme cold or extreme heat. And so if those needs are not met, you will straight up die. So a lot of times, you know, stories will operate at this level of character motivation. There's a Jack London story called To Build a Fire, where literally the character motivation is a hunter is trying to build a fire so that he doesn't freeze to death. So he's trying to meet this physiological need. Next up is safety needs, which is just security and safety. And this is kind of going to starve to death, or you're not going to like freeze to death, or, you know, you're not going to dehydrate to death. Are in a earthquake? Are you in an emergency situation where your safety is being directly threatened, right? Because if you have, let's put it this way, if you don't have water, but you're in an earthquake situation, you may not care a whole lot about like the earthquake if you're already dying of thirst. You might even see it as a mercy. But if these base needs are not cared for, these like food, water, shelter, safety, if those needs aren't cared for, then it's really hard for you to focus on anything that's higher up the pyramid, right? You have to have those basic needs cared for before you really have like the bandwidth in your brain to care about the stuff at the higher levels. So here, Maslow's hierarchy indicates that we as humans, like in stories, character motivation, if your characters don't have these basic needs met, then your character motivation is probably these things. If you're writing a war story, then your character motivation is probably to stay alive. If you're writing a survival story, like if you're reading Hatchet, then his character motivation is to survive. So once you get beyond these basic needs, you start getting into like psychological and social needs. And that's things like, you know, having friends, having a loving family, having those very kind of intimate relationships with other humans. And a lot of stories are predicated on this kind of character motivation. You know, this is every romance story, right? This is every story with like familial conflict, every story where you have like an outsider in society. This is every story where, you know, you have some kind of person looking for like where they belong in the world. If you read The Outsiders, that's the level of character motivation we're talking about. Although they do sometimes also experience those more basic level character motivations, right? How are they going to survive, right? The oldest brother, like he deals with that a lot, where he's like, how am I going to provide for my brothers? You know, characters get shot in The Outsiders. That's a safety issue. But primarily you do see a lot of this like needing to belong. And so above that, we have things like, you know, needing not just to belong, but needing to feel accomplished, needing to feel like you have a purpose in the world beyond just like, I have a loving family. And then at the top, you have, you know, self-actualization, which is that sense that you are not just accepted in society, you're not just, you know, performing a role, but you are actually fulfilling your greatest personal desires. You're fulfilling your greatest personal dreams. You're not just surviving. A really good way to think about character motivation is to start thinking about like, what is making this character behave the way that they do? And this is a great exercise in empathy, right? And that's mostly what stories are about, is learning to empathize. What's making this character behave this way? What are the motivations that are driving them to act? What does that tell me about the themes of the story? What does that tell me about the big ideas that are being presented here? Is this a story about how hard it can be to belong? Is this a story about, you know, some kind of discrimination? Is this a story about like the horrors of war? Is this a story about how war can destroy everything that we love? In that case, what's our motivation here? What's the character motivation? How is the character describing or living this theme? Another way to think about character motivation that's really, really useful is advertising's 15 basic appeals. Now, this is a little weird, but it's this sense that like every advertisement that you see is appealing to pretty much one of these 15 things. Now, some of these are very similar to one another, but contain shades of difference. And you can also kind of slot them in different places in Maslow's hierarchy. So these are also kind of like, you can think about them as advertising's basic appeals. You can also think of them as like 15 categories of human need, right? So here, number 15, we have our physiological needs that have all been kind of lumped together. But then we have kind of the upper segments of Maslow's hierarchy broken down into more specific arenas. So number one, the need for sex. Number two, the need for affiliation, the need to nurture, the need for guidance, the need to aggress, the need to achieve, the need to dominate, the need for prominence, the need for attention, the need for autonomy, the need to escape, the need to feel safe, the aesthetic sensations, enjoying beauty, and the need to satisfy curiosity. So again, if you notice, a lot of these seem very similar. Like, what's the difference between the need for guidance and the need for, or like the need to feel safe? What's the difference between the need to aggress and the need to dominate, right? Those differences are subtle, but they are there, right? The need to aggress is just the need to like get in a fight, but the need to dominate would be like the need to win that fight. You know, the need for affiliation is like the need to connect with other human beings, while the need for attention is more one directional. You just want attention from someone else. So these are also really good ways to think about character motivation at like those higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Like, why is this character behaving this way? Is it because they have a need for dominance? Do they have a need for autonomy? Do they, you know, have some kind of secret need to be nurtured and loved? What's going on here? Why are they behaving the way they are? And so understanding not just what a character is doing, but why a character is doing it is a really great next step to take that gets you beyond just that kind of like character review, like, oh, this character is tall and mean and likes to punch other people. I don't know. But you get kind of to that level below, that level deeper, that helps you understand the implications of their behavior, the implications of the way that they're written. And so we can apply this really handily to Lather and Nothing Else. So I have kept you for almost an hour, and we're not going to go the full whatever class time. We're just going to go until about 12:15. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through just a couple of examples from Lather and Nothing Else, and then sort of apply the kind of steel and character motivation stuff to them. And I'm going to ask you to then pick a moment from the text that you think also kind of shows us something about the character and like character motivation, and then post that in the chat. So if you have your story open, I think it should be available. Yeah. So if you have your story open, you can go ahead and kind of start looking for an example. If not, go ahead and open that, and then I'll run us through a couple of examples. So this is from the barber's perspective. This, you know, the whole story is. And the barber says the following: I would have to shave his beard just like any other, carefully, neatly, just as though he were a good customer, taking heed that not a single pore should emit a drop of blood, seeing to it that the blade did not slip in small whirls, taking care that the skin was left clean, soft, shining, so that when I passed the back of my hand over it, not a single hair should be felt. Yes, I was secretly a revolutionary, but at the same time, I was a conscientious barber, proud of the way I did my job, and that 4-day beard presented a challenge. So from a character, at just a character level, we learn several things about the barber, right? We learn that they are a conscientious barber, right? They're really, really, really focused on the details. You know, not a single pore should emit a drop of blood, the small whirls of hair in the beard, taking care that the skin was left clean, soft, and shiny. Like, this person is so detail-oriented. You might just say that they're not just conscientious, but they are really detail-oriented. They are very precise. They are a very, very focused person, right? You can read that into this character because the evidence is there. Now, they also admit to being a revolutionary. So that's something else we learn about them. So these two facts together give us a little bit of a picture of who this person is. And the last sentence says, and that 4-day beard presented a challenge. And then we learn that the barber goes ahead and takes up this challenge. And So maybe we can suggest that the barber enjoys a challenge, that the barber enjoys making sure that all of, the services that they provide are just perfect. And so let's start to think about character motivation. Why is the barber so careful? What kind of motivation or need is the barber expressing that makes them so cautious? Now, in general, that's probably something like, they want to have a good reputation. Maybe they really enjoy their craft. They genuinely enjoy the job that they do and they want to do a good job, which puts it kind of at that self-actualization level of Maslow's, where they want to express themselves through having a good reputation, through being a really good barber. So their motivation, we can't be sure of, but we can start to hypothesize about, like, why do they want to be such a good barber? Maybe they, want to be thought well of in their community. Maybe they want to be known as a reliable person. Maybe it is the desire for praise and attention from other people that the barber wants. We don't really know yet, but we should keep all of these potentials in mind. Why do they want to be so good at being a barber? But then the other thing we learn is that they're a revolutionary. And we kind of learn what their motivation is in the story for this. But here we say, well, why are they a revolutionary? What does that have to do with them being a barber? Well, the barber wants to do their job right. The barber knows that there is a right way of shaving someone. The barber knows that there is a right way and a wrong way, and they try their hardest to do things the right way. So we can infer from that that perhaps the barber has a very strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. And so maybe what's driving them to be a revolutionary is that same sense of, well, this current, power is wrong. And I can't just sit by and let that happen because my sense of right and wrong is so strong that in the same way that I have to be a good barber, I have to do what's right and follow my conscience militarily, politically as well. So maybe their motivation for becoming a revolutionary has something to do with just a really highly developed sense of like right and wrong in the universe. So all of these things are in the text, right? I'm not saying anything that is beyond the text. I'm not saying anything that is not evidenced. When you're reading a text, when you're making these kinds of inferences, make sure that you are still keeping your ideas about motivation grounded in the story. But beyond that, the world is your oyster. Your interpretation can be different from my interpretation because there's not really a complete picture here. The author never comes out and says, this is why the barber is so careful. This is their motivation. And because the author doesn't do that, it's up to us, the reader, to determine that for ourselves. A couple minutes. We'll go ahead and skip that second one. Go ahead and find a quote or passage in the story that you think demonstrates some kind of character trait and tells something about like the character motivation of one of the characters in this story. And then just follow it up with a brief note about kind of what you think is going on in that passage. So like, you could copy and paste like a quote like this, and then just give us a little bit about what you think it's telling us about who Captain Torres is as a person. Right, so like he's been out in the jungle, his face is really tan, he says it's as hot as the devil I want to shave. What does all of that tell you about who Captain Torres is? So all you're going to do is find a little quote from the story, post it in the chat, and follow that up with a brief note about what you think that shows us. So do post your quote and note together kind of in one so that we don't have like a lot of scattered stuff. But that is sort of our assignment for today, so to speak. You are going to take that and then build it into a paragraph. But that is it. That is all. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that anybody who watches this later doesn't just have to sit through